It's getting harder and harder to find great food at a reasonable price. Why settle for a smaller version of the real thing just to make it affordable? With Popeye's 3 for $5 special, you get the same great signature chicken we always serve. Crispy, juicy, hand-breaded chicken tossed in Louisiana spices and cooked to perfection. Don't settle for a mini meal. Come into Popeye's today and get 3 pieces of our signature chicken for just $5.
Love that chicken from Popeyes.
At select Atlanta, Georgia area restaurants. Terms apply.
It's August 27th, 1883, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ollie, the Retrospectors.
At 204 decibels, the third loudest sound in recorded history was generated by NASA's Saturn V rocket ship. The second loudest, meanwhile, at a thunderous 224 decibels, was the detonation of the Soviet hydrogen bomb. But the loudest sound of modern times emerged today in history in 1883, when the volcanic island of Krakatoa erupted, producing an ear-splitting 310 decibels in an explosion that was literally heard and felt all around the world.
Yeah, there was an account published in National Geographic in 1902 that put the reach in terms familiar to its Western readers. And to be honest, we're still pretty Western-centric, so it's still worth reading, I think. They wrote, if Vesuvius were vigorous enough to emit a roar like Krakatoa, such a report might be heard by King Edward at Windsor and by the Tsar of all Russians at Moscow. It would penetrate to the seclusion of the Sultan at Constantinople.
Crikey.
Yeah, I mean, to give a post-war analogy, the bomb that destroyed the entire city of Hiroshima in 1945 had a force of 20 kilotons, which is 10,000 times less power than Krakatoa erupting.
Yeah, the Krakatoa eruption had an explosive force of a 200 megaton bomb, and it killed more than 36,000 people and actually managed to cool the entire Earth by an average of 0.6 degrees Celsius for months to come.
Yeah, there was so much sulfur dioxide ejected into the air, and then in the air it formed sulfuric acid droplets in the stratosphere, so much so that it obscured the sun, enough to cause that dip in the global temperature, as well as months of spectacular sunsets and years of slightly darker skies. In fact, the background of the screen, which was painted in 1893, is thought to have been influenced by the intense sunsets that Munch would have witnessed in those 10 years before.
I like that idea that it's not just an emotional kind of breakdown. It was also just really spectacular sunsets.
How could you possibly imagine an intense sunset? He must have seen them.
Okay, that's enough nerd stats. I feel like I'm reading National Geographic volcanoes with my 7-year-old. Let's explain a little bit about what this was for people who still aren't clear. Krakatoa is not a volcano, but an entire volcanic island in modern Indonesia, although then part of the Dutch East Indies. It's about 100 miles west of Jakarta. And it was an island that was believed to have been formed by a previous major eruption, probably in the 5th or 6th century AD. By this point, in 1883, most people who lived there thought the volcano was extinct. People believed and had passed down orally that the thing had erupted around 2 centuries earlier, about 1680, and therefore they thought, well, it's running on empty now, we're not at risk.
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning of 1883, that was certainly the case, but actually things started to get moving in May of that year. At first, people started reporting feeling tremors and hearing explosions, first in Western Java and then on the other side of the Sunda Strait in Sumatra. And then a recording was made by a German ship, the Elizabeth, which reported seeing a column of ash and smoke that rose a full 7 miles above the island of Krakatoa on May the 20th. And then it sort of started to go a little bit quiet for a little while, but there were still these bursts of smoke and noises and the odd expulsion of ash. But far from prompting locals to evacuate, they were actually sort of seen as like natural firework displays, and they resulted in people having festivals.
Yeah, I mean, the clouds of smoke darkening the sky for weeks and months on end, and the strange lights appearing. It all sounds very ominous and scary in retrospect, but this was happening over a longish period without really escalating. And it is, it's a volcanic area generally. People didn't seem too concerned. There were even reports of chartered boats bringing visitors, because this is the other thing. I'd always imagined Krakatoa being like in the middle of the ocean, but it's actually only about 20 miles on either side from the coast of Sumatra on one side and Java on the other. So it is actually pretty easy to access, and people were taking the opportunity to go and see this, strange phenomenon.
And even the day before this day in history, August the 26th, around about 1 p.m, there was a huge volcanic blast. So then there was absolutely no ambiguity about what was going on. A huge cloud of gas and debris was sent 15 miles into the air. But it's not that was the big mega blast. That's what happened on this day at 2 minutes past 10 in the morning, propelling 50 miles into the air. It could be heard as far away as Perth, Australia, 2,800 miles away. And as you say, 36,000 people were killed, although that headline figure doesn't tell you how. And it wasn't mostly, sort of thankfully, I guess, what you might imagine of people being subsumed by burning ash. It was actually the tsunamis that were caused by the volcano's collapse afterwards. The majority of people drowned.
Yeah, about 4,500 of the fatalities were people who died in the explosion itself, and then the rest of the people were the people who were taken by tsunami. It's the same story often with earthquakes, that you get these huge tsunamis that emerge, and those are the things that do quite a lot of the damage, particularly if they're happening out at sea. But on Java, this wave, it spread enormously deeply inland. It went actually 5 miles from the coast, right through to this town of Merak. We have this report from a rice farmer who survived, but described the moment that the wave came towards him and his village on Monday morning, saying, "We saw this great black thing coming towards us." This is 5 miles in from the coast. He said it was very high, and we soon saw that it was water. Trees and houses were being washed away. He goes on to say basically that people tried to climb for their lives, but it was this incredibly terrifying thing.
At its peak, the wall of water reached 35 metres high. For context, an average British 2-storey house is 8 metres high. So you're looking at multiple houses on top of each other.
Yeah, it's like a 7-storey building.
Yeah, and there were these widely reported freak events too. A steamship that ended up a mile inland, a 600-ton piece of coral that was washed ashore. Skeletons of casualties were washing ashore in East Africa afterwards. That was how powerful the water was. There was one account of a Dutch steam packet ship, the Gouverneur-General Lunden, which was anchored in the Sunda Strait during this whole drama. The captain of the ship made the life-saving decision when he saw what was happening to turn the boat to face the incoming tidal wave, which kind of allowed it to ride through rather than being swept inland. And then even after that, the boat was being pummeled with red-hot ash, mud and pumice, and Captain Lindemann and the crew had to race around clearing the deck because it was falling so thickly that it would have sunk the boat.
There are so many reasons why I'm not a ship's captain, but that sort of quick thinking going, I know what I'll do. I'll turn towards the massive, 7-storey tsunami coming towards me.
Well, despite all of this horror, it is thought not to be the most devastating natural event of all time. Just ask the dinosaurs. But also, perhaps not even in terms of volcanoes, probably only the 5th most explosive. Mounts Toba and Tambora in the East Indies, Taupo in New Zealand, and Katmai in Alaska are all thought to have been much larger than Krakatoa. So why do we know that word? Even if you don't know the details that we've just gone through, why do we know the word Krakatoa? I think the reason essentially is because telegraphs could instantly broadcast news of it all over the world. If you're a Victorian gentleman reading your broadsheet newspaper over your eggs and toast, a bit like Lord Grantham in the first episode of Downton Abbey hearing about the Titanic, in the same way, that word, Krakatoa, the news of the tragedy spread so quickly, it felt like it was a disaster that had befallen not only its direct victims, but also to an extent, those people reading about it in what felt like them for the first time ever, real time.
Yeah, and I think the fact too that Indonesia at the time being a Dutch colonial possession and being a trading hub, there'd almost been a lead up to this story. There'd been accounts coming in from various ships' captains and passengers and travellers who passed through the area. It was a really central interchange point. So people had been hearing for a long time about this, miles high plume of ash, and these bangs were rattling windows 100 miles away in Jakarta. So they had, the groundwork had kind of been laid for this tragedy in a way.
And it did indirectly affect people in Europe and America. You talked about those sunsets. Writing in England, Gerard Manley Hopkins, the poet, described looking at skies of green, blue, gold and purple, quote, more like inflamed flesh than the lucid reds of ordinary sunsets. The glow is intense, that's what strikes everyone. It has prolonged the daylight and optically changed the season.
Yeah, and if you were an observer on the other side of the world, we're now in the age where you could understand that things that you were experiencing were being impacted by phenomena thousands of miles away on the other side of the planet. These are things that if people in medieval times, people were looking up the sky and seeing all of these strange lights or noises, that would have been considered something paranormal or religious. And by this point, there really was a global media and global communication. And this was sort of the earliest time when people could put all of these things together and realise exactly how joined up the world is in that sense.
And actually, it created a new global industry for pumice stone. That's what was raining down from the sky in large chunks on this day, which, I mean, I'm not saying it was worth it, but has been used ever since for, exfoliation, to weather fabric, denim jeans. That all comes from the widespread propagation of pumice stone as a result.
I mean, to be fair, if your entire landscape has just been covered in pumice, you must be looking around thinking, okay, I really hope somebody wants to buy this.
This episode first aired last year exclusively to members of Club Retrospectors.
Join today and unlock a new episode this Sunday.
Patreon.com/Retrospectors.
A Kia SUV is capable of taking you far. But when you use it locally to help your community, you go even further. Whether that's carrying cargo, bringing your team with you, ready? Or navigating new terrain. Power up your capability with the right Kia SUV. Do more with the Kia Sportage, Kia Telluride, Kia Sorento, or Kia Seltos. Kia. Movement that inspires. Call 800-333-4KIA for details. Always drive safely.